My name is Kenny Richter. I'm one of the SEs with Jamf Software. Today we have Nick Koval with Elan Technologies. One of the most beautiful things about the Casper Suite is there's not always one way of doing it. We heard today about user-initiated enrollment, DEP. There's other methods as well that may work for you. So today, present Nick. Take it away.
Thank you, Kenny. Appreciate it. And just to keep Kenny involved at the end of the presentation, I'm going to make him repeat the questions, so I don't have to. All right, so real quickly, you guys may have found out that docents are trying to keep people off of the set. It's really a safety issue, so just please be aware, try to stay off of the woodwork as much as possible. They gave us this nice carpet so we don't trip and fall, and then it's on live recording, so that'd be even better. All right, so as Kenny mentioned, my name is Nick Koval. This is what we're talking about. So I've had a couple of suggestions regarding what alternate names for this topic could be at this point. I think the most creative was, hey, come on, grab a club. The horse is dead, but it'll be fun. We may have talked about this a lot today and a lot yesterday, and we're probably going to talk about it a little bit more tomorrow. The reason being is it's a very important topic. Now, as a side note, I was sitting in morning break this morning, and I was sitting next to three guys as I was kind of going through my presentation again, just to make sure I was kind of solid on stuff and knew where I was going with things. And the conversation turned a little bit passionate, and the paraphrased version of where I left the conversation and they got up and went away was, well, they should just put a checkbox on Jamf Nation registration. And if you're here to talk about imaging or here to find more about imaging, it should just decline your registration. And I went, wow. So clearly there's a lot of different kind of polarized feelings about imaging and enrollment and that kind of stuff. So I'm going to try to set this straight a little bit. If you have questions, by all means, feel free to ask them. I've got a big question and answer section at the end. And then I'll be at the party tonight too, so feel free to hunt me down if we don't get a chance to connect today. All right, so as Kenny said, my name is Nick Koval. I work for a company called Elan Technologies. We're a managed service provider that's based out of Cincinnati, Ohio. We support, yeah, there we go. There's like 3 people from Cincy. Go Bearcats. Oh wait, different. Anyways, we support companies in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Kentucky, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And actually, we support all the verticals. So we have some government customers that we work with. We have a number of education customers that we work with, as well as businesses from small all the way up to Fortune 50. So I am a systems engineer, or system engineer, because I only have to deal with one system. I am a professional services engineer. I'm also the lead for that team. And I think on my badge it actually says I am the CTO. That was a title I picked up last year before I did a JNUC presentation last year. So I fulfill a lot of hats. It's kind of fun working for a small company sometimes. Now, that being said, I also have at home a wife, 2 kids, and I want to tell you a little bit about my 4-year-old as we kind of move forward in this process. Every night when my 4-year-old brushes his teeth, what he does is he brushes his teeth, he then takes his toothbrush, bangs it out on the counter so it's dry, wets it down, spritzes himself in the face with it by rubbing his thumb across the bristles, giggles as though this didn't happen this morning, wets the toothbrush down again, takes a drink from it, bangs it down on the counter and puts it away. Now, if we ask him to change that in any way, shape, or form, he screams as though we've set him on fire. So, point of the story is change is scary, okay? A company that I used to work for a while back, many Wednesdays ago, yeah, today is Wednesday, many Wednesdays ago, one of the big things that they had to say was that if we teach our children the same way we did yesterday, we rob them of tomorrow. It's an interesting saying, but it means the same thing as my 4-year-old and the toothbrush story, right? So the takeaway from this is you need to constantly evaluate what you're doing and see if there's a better way to do it. So if you take one thing away from this presentation, and I'm going to start in the middle, which is going to look like the end, like every TV drama, right? Upgrade your imaging process. So take time to evaluate it, take time to go through it, take time to see if you're doing the right thing again for your environment, especially as new operating systems come out, new technologies become available, and more to the point, maybe you finally got enrolled in DEP. How many people actually enrolled in DEP this year? Okay, so it's smattering. How about last year? A little bit more, okay. So that's kind of an ongoing process. For those of you who've been through it, you know that it is kind of a stick shift process, right? You do something and you wait, and you do something and you wait. Anyways, all right, so if you remember one thing, it's time to upgrade your imaging process. So that being said, what is imaging? Well, for those of us who are in the IT business, imaging is the process by which I spend 3 weeks going through trying to set up a computer, give it to a user, and they break it in 15 minutes, right? All right. So for the cynics among us, that is a working definition. For the rest of us, that's the process that I go through to get that machine ready for my end users. And that process obviously has goals. So what are those goals? Well, there we go. First goal, we have a stable known good starting point, right? I want to make sure that everybody's kind of on page one together. Part two, I want to provide a unified user experience. So people that are working in the same section of the business have the same stuff to do their jobs. I want to reduce my support time. I don't want to be spending time on this stuff. I have plenty of other things to do. Modern imaging, however, I think adds another thing to this, because the other part of this is to get the device under management so that I can do ongoing stuff with it, not just set it up and let it go. So, in my opinion, because there are a lot of opinions on how many types of imaging there are and what they do, but in my opinion, there are 4 types of imaging: monolithic, modular, thin, and zero imaging, or enrollment-only. We'll talk about that one last. So, monolithic. Well, a monolithic image is pretty simple. I start with a completely blank hard drive. On top of that, I grab my latest copy of the OS, or the OS that I'm comfortable with, the one that I trust, and I install that onto that hard drive. Next, I go through and I create a local admin, I run my software updates. Then I go through and I put on global settings. Next, I go through and I install software and updates to that software. Then finally, I go through and I add my user accounts and my individual settings. Now, beyond that, there may be some other things that you do. So for a minute, let's pretend like it's just you and me here, and not, we'll say 400 other people. It's just you and me. We're having a conversation about your environment specifically. All right, so that's step 1. Step 2, well, what do? I take that giant mess of stuff that I have that I now call my gold master typically, and I start running it through an application to make a copy of that image. Now, everybody knows what that little icon is that just bounced out on the side there, right? One of the more interesting, and I use the term interesting, deployments that I ran across, Time Machine was actually what they did. They set up the machine perfectly, they took a Time Machine backup of it, and then they went around to every other system with that Time Machine drive and restored it. And I died a little bit inside when they told me that story. So let's say that option works. Let's kind of not use that one. Let's put it back away where it belongs. And there are more options out there than this, right? You know, I can use anything that I want as far as imaging is concerned. If you're a command line guru, read command line freak like me. You may use disk util to pull it. You may use HDI util, combination thereof. You may use ASR to restore it. So anyways, we capture this image using our preferred application. Now, why do I personally like using Composer and teaching people to use Composer? Well, there's a couple reasons for that. First, if we actually look at Composer, there we go, check your battery. If I actually use Composer, I can take several partitions, for instance, my recovery partition and my operating system partition, and capture them together. Oh, thank God. Because I'm tired of capturing them separately. I'm tired of deploying them separately as well. On top of that, Composer does a number of things for me. So the number one thing, I get excited, right? I'm like, oh, I've got my gold master, yay! And what happens? Well, I forget that there may be temporary VM files on there. There may be stuff in my caches. More importantly, this option. So I'm only here to embarrass myself. So let's go this way. By show of hands, how many people know someone who may have deployed 5 or more gig of garbage files in the past? Yeah, exactly, right? Okay. Everybody knows somebody who's made that mistake. So this goes through and it dumps out the trashes for you. But I'm not done. Now that I've got that gold master, I still have to deploy it using something. Anything, doesn't matter, but I have to deploy it. So what do? Well, I take my favorite deployment technology and I run that image back through that deployment technology and drop it on a system. Now, as I said in our goals, one of the goals is to make sure that that system is under enrollment. We've gone through the process of enrolling it. So that's also a responsibility of my deployment technology. Or I have to do it manually. Who likes manually in this room? Yeah, like 3 people. And usually that's for cooking, right? That's not for Casper stuff. All right, so Monolithic comes with some pros and cons. There are some things that it does great, small list. There are a lot of things that I don't like about it, bigger list. First and foremost, it is really quick to deploy. If you've got a monolithic image, it's all in one file. I can do a block copy, dump it on there, and I'm done. If I'm doing Thunderbolt to Thunderbolt imaging of a block, I want to say the last time I did it was like 3.5 minutes for a 15 gig image. It's quick, right? In some cases, it's actually quicker if you don't compress the image. Yeah, surprising. So it takes a lot of time to make one of these. The last time I did it for a customer because they had no other deployment technology in place, it took like 2.5 weeks. Because I kept having to give them the image and say, okay, test it. And they'd come back with a list of stuff. And my favorite part about that list was if you looked at the list, the first list and the second list had items on there that were opposite of each other. This needs to be in the dock. Can you remove this from the dock? All right. So it also takes up space, right? So if you were paying attention, if you looked at that slide where I had the operating system and then all the different things, there were some lines in that slide. Those lines are breakpoints because I am a pessimist and a skeptic. Read IT supervisor of any kind. And that means that when I go through and build an image, I want to have some breakpoints to roll back to. So it's never a, hey, let's go back to the drawing board and start again. All right? So a 45 gig image, in some cases, may take 200 gig or more to store all the pieces and all the breakpoints. All right, we get it. There's a lot of drawbacks. Keep moving. So it requires post-deployment work. I have to do extra work once I get the image laid down there. I have to individualize it for my environment. Then finally, it's not easily modifiable. If you're not like me and you don't keep breakpoints, if you find a problem with that image, you either have to restore it, fix it, and take a new image, or you get to start again. Who loves starting again in IT? Yeah, exactly. That involves a 6-pack at least, right? All right, so that's monolithic imaging. At this point, let's skip over to modular. So modular is essentially the answer to a lot of the problems we have with monolithic imaging, right? So what I do is instead of starting with a blank hard drive, I take all of those packages that I have, I stick them in my deployment technology. I'm hoping you recognize what this is. And I start using that deployment technology to lay them down. So I start with my operating system. Next, I go to some of the software and updates that I need to put on there. Then I go to my general settings. Then I go to my user accounts and those settings. And then finally, I enroll that device. Great, it's under enrollment. That, end goal, get it under enrollment. Now, this is a little bit different though, because as you notice, I didn't put as many tools up here this time. We're a little bit more dependent on our choice of tools for how this works. And I know some of you out there have decided you want to keep your Deploy Studio. That's perfectly fine. I know some of you want to keep Casper Suite and use it that way. Doesn't matter. I know some of you do other things. All of those are perfectly acceptable because, like I said, as long as at the end of the day it ends up under management, that's what we really care about. All right, so what are the pros and cons on this? Well, because it's modular, it's easy to modify, right? I just take one of those packages, dump it, grab the new version, stick it in Deploy Studio workflow, or for those of you who use the Casper Suite, configuration. And at that point, it's good to go. All right. So next up, it's not very time consuming. I don't spend time making a gold master. I get to skip all that stuff and jump right to get stuff on the box and test it. Because, testing doesn't take any time at all. All right, so it does still take up some space. The most space that this usually takes up, if you're not using an Adobe product, is the operating system. If you are using an Adobe product, then the operating system drops a little bit to number 2. All right, and like I said already, it requires some better tools. All right, so let's get out of here. Let's jump over to thin imaging. So what's the story on thin imaging? And I've heard this described a couple of different ways this week. So again, my opinion is that thin imaging, we have that same setup. We've got our computer, we've got our deployment software, and we don't put an operating system on there. It's about trust. We are trusting the fact that the operating system on that computer is valid and working. After that, we start putting on our updates. Then we put on our software and updates. Then at that point, it starts looking exactly like it did before. So we've got our software updates, we've got our global settings, we've got our user accounts and settings, and then finally, we enroll it. All right, so let's talk about this one for a second. Same thing, easy to change packages, right? Secondly, it saves space because we don't have to worry about storing an OS. But current OS. Anyone care to take a guess why this is in the middle of the screen and not on either side? Because for a lot of us, the current operating system is great until the current operating system is not. And if you don't have a copy of the current operating system that was great, you start kicking yourself because now you got a copy of the current operating system that's not so great. So, moral of the story, if you're using this, keep copies of your OS just to be safe. And then, of course, it requires better tools. We have to use something that can handle this type of deployment. All right. So that's what I qualify as a thin image. I know there are other people out there with different, but when I say thin image, that's what I'm talking about. So now, what about this enrollment-only option? So I asked you earlier how many of you use the Device Enrollment Program, or DEP. And what we ended up with there was a fair few of you, right? So at least you're trying this, you're playing with it, you're seeing how it works for you. Well, what's involved? And I haven't heard a presentation that really covers this section, so forgive me for a little bit. I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about this. So what happens is I do some pre-work. I take that computer, I put it on deploy.apple.com, I link that computer to one of my MDM servers, so one of my mobile device management servers. Once it's linked, then I go to that mobile device management server and I say, hey, I need you to set up this way. Now that's fairly general, but that's how it works depending on what your MDM is. If you're using Casper, you create a pre-stage enrollment and you continue saying, hey, this is what I want to be on this machine. Now, one thing that I've found out, when you start using pre-stage enrollments, you can skip things, right? So for those of you who've done this before, you can skip things like the terms and conditions. You can skip things like Siri. You can skip things like location services. Two things on that. One, if you skip it, that does not disable it. That just accepts whatever the base choice is. Two, if you skip it, just be aware that your end users may have to fill that data in somewhere else. So just be aware that by skipping it, you may be causing a little bit more work for your end user, or maybe yourself if you're the one who has to write the documentation that says, hey, go find this and enter your Apple ID. All right, the other note about this, and I actually wrote myself a note and stuck it, I left it in my bag though. I was gonna stick it right up here so I didn't forget. I was on a deployment one day and I found out that if you check the box to say, don't allow the MDM to be removed, you get a nice big fat fail warning when you try to enroll the device with DEP. And the reason for that is what happens is this. So I power on that computer, or I power on that mobile device. The mobile device gets to the point where it decides, hey, I need to activate against Apple's servers. So it goes out, it talks to some server out in Apple's section of the network, and what happens? Well, that server looks at the information it gets from the computer or from the mobile device, and it says, you, sir, have a JSS, and you need to go talk to it over here. So then that device goes, okay, hi, JSS, my name is so-and-so, this is my information. What do I need to do? And the JSS then says, well, you need to do all this stuff. But as part of that, it sends down a second copy of that MDM enrollment certificate. And because the first copy it got said, for the love of God, don't let the end user remove this, it can't overwrite it, so it fails. So keep that in mind. I know there's a feature request bug fix, something along those lines for that. But just be aware of that when you're doing DEP setups. Anybody had that happen to them and sat there and gone, okay, what the heck? Yeah, there's two guys in the back there, there's another one over there. Anybody upstairs? I got two guys asleep over there. What is that, Minecraft? What are you doing? I'm just messing with you, I'm sorry. All right, next up, end user enrollment. And this is done through the website. Anybody have experience with this? All right, sometimes I prefer to call this trick my end users into clicking on this website. True story, our VP of operations absolutely refused to enroll his system into management. Couldn't get him to click on an invitation, couldn't get him to do anything. So I finally told everybody in the office that he works in, under no circumstances are they to support him until I say otherwise. Yeah. What's it like when mom and dad fight? That didn't go over all that well, but his machine is now under management. I think I lost a few points that day. Anyways, so I go to a website, right? I log in with my credentials and I go through the process of enrollment. Another option, as I mentioned, email. I can email an invitation out to somebody. I can email an invitation to a lot of people and get them into management. Okay. So I heard something. Anyway, sorry. I'm getting old, my hearing's going. This is by far the quickest thing to deploy on the planet. It is extremely slick. And Apple has gone through a lot of work to make it so, and they're actually making it better every time you go through that process. So, middle of the road again, right? Everything you do at this point is under management. So, That's a good thing for those of us who like to manage. For those of us who are new to the Casper Suite, that can be a little daunting. There's a little bit of fear involved in there because it's like, okay, I knew imaging, I understood imaging. This management thing I'm still working out. Then, hey, there's your old friend, the current operating system. How do we feel about that? You know, again, sometimes yes, sometimes no, sometimes one way or the other. All right, the one drawback that I have to this is DUP requires a lot of setup that's new to a lot of people. You know, it's what Chip was talking about, right? Here's what everybody's doing with imaging, and you just walk over here and do something completely different. And I feel sorry for the poor camera guy who just tried to follow me. So once you do that completely different thing, it's brand new. It's like, okay, is this really going to work? And you find out, hey, it does. But I did put that as a drawback because, you know, it's brand new. On top of that, if you don't have the ability to take advantage of DEP, then you're stuck with user-based enrollment. And as we already talked about, that can be hit or miss depending on who you're working with. So you can try the really big carrot and the little tiny stick. I've got a real life working case where the little stick didn't cut it and I had to get something bigger. All right. So that's enrollment only. These are the four types of management, or pardon me, the four types of imaging that I discuss and I worry about and keep me up at night. So if we go back and we look at our goals, well, what were they? We wanted to have a stable, known good starting point. Any of those models does that. We wanted to provide a unified user experience. Again, okay. We want to reduce our support times. And then finally, we want to get everything under management. But if we really start thinking about it, if we start listening to the conversations that are going on, if we start listening to a lot of the presentations that you guys have heard so far, and we'll conclude tomorrow, and a lot of the other stuff that's out there, aren't those first three really management? I think so. So if that's the case, let's upgrade the imaging process. Let's figure out how to reduce the amount of time that we as IT spend generating that image and increase the amount of time that we spend managing the user base that's out there. The big thing for me personally is that if I work on imaging, that work affects the end users one time when they first come on board, or when I'm dealing with a school, start of the fall semester or start of the school year, and it affects them again when we swap out their machine. So that's 2 touch points. If I spend a lot more time managing and a lot less time imaging, that touch point could be daily, where I'm interacting with my users and getting them squared away. All right, so that being said, if you're going to upgrade your imaging process, I would encourage you to have a test environment to do this, because there's nothing like breaking something in your production environment. Now, I am, as I mentioned, a professional services engineer, which means that we do jump starts on behalf of Jamf software. So I've gone out, there are a number of folks in this room that I recognize that I have jump started before. One of the things that I found out Monday at our integrator session was that your technical account manager can provide you temporary information to spin up a JSS for testing. So if you have a local JSS and you need an additional activation code, you don't want to use your own, they can get you a temporary one that you can try out stuff with. If you're using a cloud instance, how many people are using cloud? Okay, so there's a fair few. That's more than I expected. If you have a cloud instance, they will happily spin up another cloud instance for you to test and try and break stuff in that is not in your current instance. All right, so show of hands, how many people actually knew that? Okay, more than I expected, but still not half. All right, so still good knowledge. All right. So if I'm upgrading my imaging process, that means that I'm trying to get stuff out of imaging and stick it into management, because that's how I'm going to get my time. I'm going to slim down my modular image. I'm going to slim down my thin image and deploy less at that time and more when I've enrolled stuff into my JSS. So what does that actually look like? Well, for those of you who are new to the JSS, forgive me, I grabbed this slide on my presentation last year. This is how a policy works. A trigger goes off, my computer checks into the JSS. A policy gets downloaded from the JSS, shoved onto my computer and run. Fairly simple. Policies are what do the work. So for most of us, how many people have this particular policy? I guess by show of hands, how many people don't have a policy named this? So it's like, okay, there's like 4 people over here. There's 1 over there. Okay, there's a couple. Patch management, we're all hoping for it. We all want it. We know it's coming. And, like Dean told us yesterday, it's going to be done right when it gets here. Unfortunately for all of us, here is not now. And then is not soon enough. So, my issue with this basic policy is that I have to interact with it a lot, especially if I'm dealing with a lot of laptop users. What happens if I run this policy and the laptop user closes their lid? Policy fails. Nuts. Okay, so that's fine. There's a button in there. I can go into the policy. I can hit flush all failures. Well, that's great. But I have to keep doing that until this policy finishes its deployment. And that's kind of annoying. So, this is really what my policy looks like for updating Adobe Flash. First of all, ignore the fact that I've added a message there to try to involve the end user and let them know, hey, by the way, I just did some work on your machine. Anyways, you'll notice that I added the update inventory step. It's still deploying the same thing. But this, instead of running once on every computer, it's ongoing. And it runs only on stuff that's in a smart group that happens to be called plugins Adobe Flash needs update. So what does that smart group look like? Well, that's what that smart group looks like. It looks at who has the current version of Adobe and gets rid of them. Or pardon me, Adobe Flash, not Adobe. That's a whole different series of smart groups. It's a bigger group. Anyways, and it also looks at who meets the requirements for Flash. So this allows me to do a couple of things, right? I can check to make sure that people meet requirements before I just send software down to them. The cool thing about this is this works regardless of the state of the computer coming in. It can come in through DEP. It could come in through enrollment. It could come in through modular or monolithic imaging. It doesn't matter. This takes over, management happens. So, okay, logical question. Well, what's my requirements group look like? So, I'm a member of 10.6 or later because that's actually on Adobe's website. You have to have 10.6 or later, have the current version of Flash. 511 meg of RAM, or pardon me, more than 511 meg of RAM. I don't know what horrible thing could have possibly happened to a MacBook Air that would cause it to have less than 512 meg of RAM, but let's just play the contingency plan in case. And then finally, you'll notice this bottom line. Department is not kiosk. So I use this not only for what are the system requirements, but what are the requirements for a piece of software within my own organization? So it happens twofold. I do not typically put OS requirements or operating system requirements on my packages. I find that to be a little bit tedious. I rather just stick them in this requirements group, and then across all of the JSSs that I administer, and across the 3 other people that administer those JSSs with me, it's fairly consistent. And then finally, what does my current version look like? Well, my current version says, hey, if I as Casper have installed Flash, and it's this version of the package, we're good. Or if maybe the end user beat me to the punch, and they're running something that's newer, we're good. Now, this is a simplified version. There's a little bit of flaky math and stuff that I do on the real one with what the plugin version is, so that if they have a newer version than that, it doesn't say, oh, you need the old version, and then fail over and over and over again. But this is a simplified version that works in a lot of very simple, 50 people or less environments, where those users aren't as quick on updating Adobe Flash as I am. And then our help desk just every week looks to see if there's a new version of Flash. We test it and deploy it. Our management team, to my knowledge, has not in 7 months gotten a little pop-up that says, hey, Adobe Flash is out of date, because I've managed to stay ahead of the curve because of this. And it just runs ongoing until I get that thing out there. All right, so that's an example of how we can move stuff to management. Like I said, our goal is really take stuff out of that imaging stack and move it into the management stack. If you're not comfortable going all the way to DEP right now, then start by pulling little bits out. Grab your Java updates, stick them only on the management side. Grab your Flash updates, stick them only on the management side. Trust me, your life will get a lot happier if you do it that way, because you won't be updating two things. All right, so big thank you to everybody who came out. Big thank you to Jamf, obviously, for Casper Suite, because we love it. Also, my poor wife and my family, but my wife especially, who's had to put up with me muttering about all this stuff as I've been putting my presentation together. And thank you all for attending. That being said,
Thank you very much, Nick.
so that being said, we'll kick it over to Kenny, and he's going to play Repeater.
So I'm going to attempt to hear what you say and repeat it in here. And as my wife will tell you, I'm not a very good listener, so I may ask you to repeat yourself. My apologies in advance.
Down front here.
So your last slide was one of the things I was waiting for you to get further on, and you said, are you doing some math to see if the current version of Flash is newer or older? It's not an easy thing to do to check a version number, because 19.0.0.185 is not a decimal. How do you know mathematically what is the most current version of whatever application it is?
So what I end up doing, go ahead, sorry. Yeah, you have to repeat. You get to talk. Yes.
I'm going to paraphrase what you said, please. So basically, the question is around tracking of versions when you have decibels and understanding the way integers work. So, Nick.
So, yeah, if we go back to this particular slide is what we were talking about. That version number at the bottom, I said I'd do some funny math on that. Basically what happens is I've got a couple of extension attributes that dissect those numbers. Now, unfortunately, that class wasn't extremely well attended. There was a session on deploying, what was it? It was a session on testing. So it was IT guy out in Massachusetts who was using Casper to do testing. One of the interesting things that he figured out that I'm going to have to start dealing with and start using is he figured out how to do, based on an article that he found, essentially a small inventory update. So what it does is he triggers a policy that runs, and that policy actually uses the APIs and updates specific items within his JSS at more frequent intervals than a normal inventory update, because an inventory update can be quite large. And if you do it quite often, you put a lot of stress on your JSS. But combining those two things together, I think might give me a really good result that I can duplicate. Make sense? Yeah, what it really is I boil down, take essentially the first number and the last number, and I do a greater than on both of those to find out if the version that's on there is newer or older. All right, let's see, who else we got? Anybody over there? Nope. Kenny, anybody on your side?
See, you got right up here.
Throughout this whole process, a couple of sessions that we've gone to talking about imaging, we use D-trees where we're at. Basically, you're not familiar with
I'm familiar with it, yeah.
So D-trees kind of throws a wrench in it. It almost seems like we're going to have a major paradigm shift to be able to take advantage of this kind of stuff.
All right, once again, I'm going to paraphrase. So currently he is using deep freeze, and so it's going to be a big paradigm shift to move from using deep freeze over to a enrollment management ongoing, and recommendations on that transition.
So deep freeze, there's a couple of ways you can deal with it. The least elegant is involving having some downtime maintenance periods where you actually disable deep freeze. So you run the script, it reboots the machine, and at that point, that computer says, hey, I'm no longer in deep freeze. I'm no longer frozen. If you combine that with some of the things from Jamf Helper, you can actually lock the screen so nobody can do anything while you're messing with that machine. And then typically in those cases, the policies that you have end up getting scoped to, is the machine thawed or frozen? Because there are extension attributes that are built in that you can grab for deep freeze that will tell you if the machine is thawed or frozen. But trying to understand or trying to set those maintenance periods where you can say, hey, this is the time period where my machine is going to be open and available for maintenance. The other thing that I've seen people do, and I don't have firsthand experience with this, so I apologize. I have seen people go through the process of setting up another location, because deep freeze, newer versions of it, instead of freezing the entire hard drive, will leave certain areas open. And what you can do is if you leave the root, library, application support, Jamf waiting room unfrozen or thawed as a space that you can write stuff to, you can cache policies, and it will stick all the installer files in that waiting room. Then you thaw the machine, tell it to install all the cache software, reboot, and then freeze the machine again. And that'll at least cut down on that period where you have to do certain things.
Any other way, because the only time the machines are on is when the kids are using them. They close them up, which is hard.
So follow-up question was?
Any other way of doing it? Because the students, when the machine's on, they're using it. Otherwise, they close it, they're off.
His voice is a little deeper. Can you drop it just a little?
Oh, like Barry Manilow.
There we go. All right. So honestly, I don't know of any other way to do that other than trying to figure out some static maintenance periods in there where people leave the machines on and running. Because like you said, with deep freeze, I've got to reboot that machine. So if an end user opens it up and the machine just instantly reboots, they're like, let me grab another one off the cart. And then that one instantly reboots, and it starts leaving that bad flavor in everybody's mouth. So yeah, unfortunately, I don't know of a better one. If anyone does know of a better solution for deep freeze, please find him during the Jamf party. You're going, right? Okay, good. All right, in the back. So,
Can you please, yes. Can you please provide a workflow for thin imaging of re-imaging machines?
Yes, Kenny. If you can ask me as Kenny from South Park. I actually have an orange hoodie in my bag. No, I'm kidding. Anyways, so how you re-image, and this is where things get a little bit more interesting, because as I've gone to more and more organizations, I've found that certain departments actually image differently within the organization. And certain machines get imaged differently on the organization. So the number one thing that I usually end up seeing is what happens when the computer itself needs to be re-imaged for another end user. You know, how do I get it back into that workflow again? I do see a lot of people that just have a very small monolithic image that has the OS, and then it pushes it under enrollment, and at that point, it takes over. I don't see that thin image model being reused unless there's a caching server in place. And at that point, they reboot to the recovery partition, do a reinstall, it downloads it from the caching server, which is very quick, and then you can go through that thin imaging process again. I have a customer right now that's actually their preferred method, and I'm trying to get them to anything else, because I hate that weird, like, manual stick shifting clutch period of, hey, I've got a new OS, but there's nothing here. And then I have to target disk mode it and drop stuff on there. it doesn't match up right. Another case in point is I have seen a lot of people who use a full monolithic image only for kiosk machines. You know, they run that until the dust bunnies in the machine eat through the wires and the magic smoke gets released, and then they re-image it again from a monolithic image. But yeah, as far as that goes, the most elegant solution I see is drop thin imaging, go to modular, reduce it as much as you can, and put everything else in management. All right? Who else? Let's go with one down front.
I'm wondering if you can help me understand the subtlety or the difference between thin imaging, where we trust the existing base OS and only enroll and install things on top of it, versus the enrollment-only imaging process that you described.
Would you please help me understand the difference between thin imaging versus enrollment only?
Okay. So the idea of this trust that exists, with thin imaging, I'm trusting that Apple put a good OS on that system, right? Whether it's out of the box and still shrink wrapped, or it's something that I've done a Command R, rebooted, run it through, and I've gotten a fresh image, hopefully off of my caching server. But I'm trusting that download at that point. With DEP, with the device enrollment program, the same thing is true. I'm trusting, well, in that case, not only am I trusting the operating system that's there, I'm also trusting that DEP correctly says during the activation process in the setup assistant, hey, of all the great wide world web servers out there, get this machine to that JSS over there. So there's a lot more trust that goes on there. I don't expect anyone to just go, hey, it's DEP, we're awesome. I expect you to play with it. I expect you to try it out. Both of those two options depend heavily on you trusting Apple. So, do you trust Apple? It's one of those things where you have to test. You've got to go through whatever that current OS is, you got to test it in your environment. I'm, like I said, a pessimist and a skeptic. We have not gone to Yosemite yet. Next week, I'm doing all the testing for it, and we'll see what happens. Pardon me, not Yosemite, yeah. Jeez. We're not that far back, sorry.
Wow.
El Capitan, yeah. I always feel weird when I say El Capitan, and I feel like I have to say El Capitan. All right, I saw somebody over here by the aisle, yeah. So, request. What was that request, Kenny?
I think the request is you'd like to see some of this stuff out on Jamf Nation, right? Cool. I do believe slides will be posted.
Funny story. Last night when I got back to the hotel and I had absolutely nothing better to do with my time, I took my slides and I posted them up. But wait, there's more. When I do slideware, like when I do these kind of presentations, I actually develop a script for it first. So I sat down in Pages on the iPad while my wife was driving. I tried really hard to focus on just the iPad. Again, my apologies to my wife. So I tried really hard to focus on the iPad and bang out that script. So what I did was I actually took that script and cut it down and stuck it in over top of my presenter's notes. Because as Kenny can verify, my presenter's notes actually have the word click in there. And we're all surprised that I haven't read that word yet. So I actually took that script, cut it down, stuck it in the presenter notes, and that's what I uploaded. So if you go to this session right now, you will actually see all the presenter notes, all the background information that I put in, as well as this presentation. So at least it's a start. Does it have the settings? I mean, it's got this stuff on there. I do actually have the presentation I did last year at the JNUC that has a little bit more of this stuff on there as well. So, but I'll absolutely take that under advisement. And oh, specifically the extension attributes where you kind of piddle, yeah, okay. That one's gonna take a little bit longer for me to grab that, but yes. All right. Everybody's in a party mood, Kenny. All right, up here on the aisle.
This is more of a DEP question than an imaging question. But we lease our machines from a company that does not participate in the I asked them about it, and they basically kind of don't do what I'm talking about. They just basically come on, buy the stuff from Apple, and lease it to us. Is there any way for us to participate in DEP in that instance?
So the question is around where they're getting their equipment. They are leasing, and that company does not participate in DEP. So what are my options?
Yeah, unfortunately, in that case, your only option is really change the company you're working with. For those of you who don't know the real 30-second thing behind DEP, well, I could do more than that because we do have 8.5 minutes left. But the 30-second thing behind DEP is it's really about chain of custody. And when you get a computer that is in DEP, Apple can verify that it hasn't left. They can account for it every step of the way from manufacturing to the time it ended up on your doorstep. And if a vendor is not participating in DEP, what that means is they cannot verify that. So that machine left wherever it was manufactured. I'll leave that alone. It got on a boat, maybe a slow boat from wherever it was manufactured. At that point, it arrived in the United States. It went to a warehouse. It did X, Y, Z. There are third parties that are members of DEP that have gone through that process. Unfortunately, the company you lease through is not one of them. I can tell you that Apple leasing is sometimes pretty aggressive on what they look for. So it's worth talking to either somebody at an Apple retail store. I know a few in the audience, even though they just scampered. Or it's also worth talking to your Apple rep if you're, education or different business or something like that. So yeah, unfortunately, there's nothing you can do with those machines. They're out in the cold at this point.
Question to follow up, can I take a spreadsheet of serial numbers and machine names and import it so that even though they're not coming from Apple, they're pre-seeded into my JSS?
The follow-up question to that is being able to take a spreadsheet, CSV file of serial numbers and get that uploaded. Into the JSS.
So are we talking about something that's not DEP, but I want to get into my JSS? You can do that. It will not enroll those devices. Okay? So, you can basically put in a record nub that has that information in there. It is kind of involved because it does require, at this point, using the API. Talk to your technical account manager, your TAM, and they may have some more information for you on how to do that. Right in the center.
We're a K-12, and so we deal with high school students. We're a one-to-one in our high school. I want to see by show of hands how many people hide their local admin account.
All right, so K-12 folks out there, how many of you hide your local admin account? Raise your hands, please.
Keep your hands up. How many people not in education, how many other people hide your Casper admin account? Yeah, so that's what I thought. All right, so given that,
One of the issues we came up with, I don't know if it was a version number or something in our, let's just say 50% of machines that we would image, we would do just the Thunderbolt imaging, our local account wouldn't beat it. So we couldn't get into the device. So then for a half a semester, we just grabbed a quick image, put the local account on there. That was our monolithic image. And then we pulled that down. So at least we knew that account was going to be on there. I never got past it, but how are you enrolled? I've got it. How are you enrolled? I'm just using Casper imaging. Okay. I've got a piece of software that I actually use to detect the local account on there. Yeah. Called Create User PKG. It's actually an app store, but you can download it separate. Create User PKG is what I use. All right.
I am so letting you paraphrase that.
I was going to say, do I paraphrase that? Basically, he's had some issues at some point where about 15% of machines were not getting the local admin account, so they did not have access. Another gentleman recommended Create User PKG as an option.
Hidden admin accounts, just as a general rule, Apple has changed the methodology for hiding those accounts. They actually have a K-base article up there that says, this is how to do it under El Capitan, this is how it was done under Yosemite, this is how it was done under various versions. And the problem is, I've found during testing that not all of those are compatible with each other. So in some cases, I've had to unhide the account, then do an update or an upgrade, and then re-hide the account using the new method for hiding it. It gets even hairier if you're trying to go from one machine to another with Migration Assistant and hidden accounts. You're honestly better off creating a policy that goes through and unhides those accounts for those particular times, and then re-hides them again once it's done on the new version. All right. Gentleman on this side of the aisle.
Question. How many people have seen El Capitan Migration Assistant fail?
So how many of you have seen the El Capitan Migration Assistant fail? Nailed it.
One guy up there. Okay. So, I mean, you know, Apple's been doing the Migration Assistant for a long time now. They've put a lot into there. So if it's failing, it's got to be for some interesting reason that I'd love to take a look at the logs and see, you know, what's causing that. All right, anybody else? 4 minutes left, 3 minutes and 10 seconds left. Right down here in front.
In terms of the Adobe Flash update, why not just turn the checkbox in Adobe and let it update itself?
So why not let Adobe just update itself by checking the box?
Okay, so by show of hands, how many have had that work? Certain environments, okay, so I'm seeing a little bit of this, a little bit more of this, and a lot of this.
If you have it on 500 machines, do you really want to download 500 times?
Exactly. Yeah. But yeah, so the thing with this is I can kind of guarantee that Adobe gets updated. If I go through and check the box, just like most of you, I've seen some mixed results on that. It sometimes works, it sometimes doesn't. With this, I can blame Casper when it doesn't work, or in one case I've actually had to blame as a bad download. But typically, this works all the time. What is it they always say? Statistically, 85% of the time, this works every time. Anyways. All right, anybody else?
I had another question, if that's all right.
Yeah.
When you lay down a full OS, you're going to get I like Suite. But because we have users who are going to reallocate this machine, now when that new user wants to update it, they need the Apple ID of the original user. So what we do sometimes is we'll lay it all down, pull it off, and then make them use PPP and get that license. Does that help everyone else is doing it?
So the question is about monolithic imaging, laying down the OS, but it's going to be a new user. Sometimes it's associated with an Apple ID. What's everyone else doing?
So typically in my experience, what I've found that works best for me, Apple has a way that you can go through, and anytime you purchase hardware from them, you can take the iLife suite and get back VPP managed distribution licenses for all those that are out there. So that's typically step one for me. Step two is once I have those, I actually do take them completely out of my monolithic or modular image. And at that point, I leave it to the end user so that I can lease that app out to them. And then once they're no longer part of my institution, domain, whatever, I can retract it and get that license back. All right, there was somebody up in that area. Yeah,
Sure.
If you install, if you do a wipe and install, you don't get iLife on default, or use AutoDMG to create a base list, you don't get iLife. If you're using a machine, let's say it's a new machine with a fork built with the OS, you go into the old launcher, hold the option key, and you can actually remove the apps that will physically remove it so the machine never thinks of it ever installed. You want to get those off of there.
come on, Kenny, let's hear it.
So holding the option key, when you're reinstalling, you have the option to not install.
No, if you're taking, let's say you take out a fork,
Yes, I knew it was coming.
Launcher. If you go to the application, launcher, the dashboard, I forget what it's called. Not mission control, but close. Anyway, if you hold the option key down, you can remove any of the pre-installed apps, and it'll remove as far as PKG util is concerned, those apps were never installed. It's like it's a way of removing App Store apps from the machine.
Yep. So great piece of advice, and that's it. We're now at 4:01. So that being said, if you got any other questions for me, I'll be around. I know it's a little hard to find the one bald guy. Probably the one bald kind of big guy in the sea of bald big guys. That seems to be a hairstyle recently. But I will definitely be over at the party. So thank you.